Yes, so I'm delighted to be joined by Geoff Crocker, who is the editor of The Case for Universal Basic Income, also the author of Basic Income and Sovereign Money, The Alternative to Economic Crisis and Austerity Policy. So first of all, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
It's clear there's been a huge increase in interest in universal basic income over the last few years. Most of that seems to come from the automation side of things. So the kind of the Andrew Yang argument that we need universal basic income to deal with rising power of AI and rising automation. Is that where you come from? Is that where you come from, or you kind of got a deeper, longer interest in it?
Well, I came to it from that perspective, yes. So, I mean, I trained in economics, and then my main career was in technology market strategies as a consultant for some large internationals like IBM, ABB, Yamaha, and so on. And I began to look more widely and deeply at the effect of technology and automation, i.e. not just on my client's business, but on the macroeconomy. And I began to suspect that automation was indeed sucking income, aggregate income, out of the economy. So I took a career break and did an MA in philosophy of science. And from that, wrote a first book on philosophy of technology. And that then developed into the latest book that you just kindly quoted on basic income and sovereign money. Because if income is sucked out of the economy by automation, because by definition, you get less wage input per unit of output. So the proportionality between the output you're producing and the wage that you're paying changes. And real wages have flatlined for a very long time in the United States for that reason. Of course, there are two slightly conflicting and competing explanations for this. Some people think it's entirely to do with the reduction in bargaining power for labor, i.e. it's a political problem, and others think that it's a technical problem to do with automation reducing wage content. I actually think both explanations are complementary, because by definition, if automation reduces the demand for labor, then labor's bargaining power is therefore reduced. So the two explanations are rather complementary. But also, I think most of us would recognize, even if only anecdotally, but also from macroeconomic data, that automation is changing the nature of the labor market. It's bifurcating it into hugely well-paid skilled jobs and hugely badly paid lower skilled jobs. So you get, in-work poverty, you get job dissatisfaction, bullshit jobs, and all the rest of it. So it's a major economic and social challenge that we face. And my conclusion was that basic income was a necessary result from that.
Do you think of long-term as kind of technological employment as something which is going to happen or already started happening? So I was really interested in the Andrew Yang argument that part of the rise of Trump was technological employment in the kind of the Midwestern states. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I thought it was an interesting argument. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, well, I don't put the argument in terms of technological unemployment, because the riposte to that is, well, why everybody's fully employed. I put the argument in terms of aggregate wage in the economy. And my argument is, which I back up from data in the UK economy, going back to 1948, in the whole post-war economic period. I have a nice little graph that shows that labor income, that's both wage and self-employed income, that labor income gradually becomes a lower and lower proportion of consumer expenditure. In 1948, our labor income was more than our consumer expenditure. That changed in 1995 when they became equal. And since then, consumer expenditure has been increasingly more than labor income. And so people's income for consumption has been coming from non-labor income, i.e. from pensions, from dividends, from household debt, which is the worrying factor to enable people to maintain necessary expenditure. So that's a 70-year phenomenon. And of course, the futurists, the Brynjolfssons and McAfees and so on in the second machine age, and various studies, whether it's by McKinsey, OECD, and so on and so forth, pointing out that this is only going to increase. So it's a very long-term phenomenon in my view.
And when you say increase, I mean, do you have any kind of rough idea what sort of scale we're talking about, say, over the next 20 or 30 years?
Well, I'm not good at these quantitative guesses, how many jobs are going to be lost, because as I say, it's not necessarily about job loss, it's about reduction of income in the economy. But certainly as you see automation move from simple functional tasks like screwing a car wheel onto a car axle in a factory or something. And you see it moving into various aspects of AI. It may not be terribly complex AI, but it may just be searching, for example, for a medic, searching through to find links between symptoms and disease diagnostics, or lawyers looking through case law and so on. So it can be fairly simple models and paradigms used that are automated that start to affect more skilled professions. And of course, once you get up to AI, which is capable of making decisions and creating concepts and so on, that's a slightly futuristic concept. But the march of automation into more skilled jobs is virtually here.
Yeah. Following on from that, I mean, you read from some supporters of UBI online, what seems like a slightly utopian vision. But they kind of argue that in the, maybe not in the short to mid term, but in the long term, we should have a society where the current compulsory work, where everyone works 40 hours a week or whatever, is a thing of the past, and work becomes largely or somewhat voluntary, and is topped up by money created by automation, by AI. Is that something you regard as plausible?
Yeah, because if you look at, again, the last 100 years, working hours per week have massively reduced. So, I mean, 100 years ago, and I've got a graph of this, but it's not all in my head, you're roughly talking about 100 hours a week, coming down to 70 hours a week, coming down to now about 35 hours a week. And of course, Keynes predicted in the future of our grandchildren talk, which actually was just a school talk he gave, so it wasn't an academic paper, but nevertheless, speculating that we could get down to 15 hours a week. So if we've happily accommodated a 35-hour week rather than a 70-hour week, and I don't hear many people arguing back to a 70-hour week, apart from some people who are job obsessed, we've accommodated the increase either in leisure or the increase in freedom to work as we wish. So the idea that our nature, our ontology, who we fundamentally are, is defined by a 9-to-5 office structure or an 8-to-4 factory structure, is an artificial construct. I mean, we've worked with it through the industrial age. We're now moving into the information age. People have proved for a start that they can work from home throughout the COVID pandemic. So the nature of work is changing, and the requirement for it is changing. And there is an opportunity for us to think, actually, do we want to be so work-centric in our thinking of who we are? This idea that our dignity comes from our work. I mean, whilst work can contribute to dignity because, you feel I've done something really worthwhile, here's the product, here's the loaf I've baked, or whatever it is. It's not the only source of dignity. Otherwise, people who didn't work would have no dignity, which is clearly incorrect. And so, human dignity is inherent in the person. And I think we will need to have to rethink this huge psychological, philosophical and economic dependency that we've developed over work. It's not that work is a bad thing, because although it can be, I mean, some forms of work are extremely unfulfilling, extremely arduous, extremely backbreaking. So, I mean, we're all glad for the automation of the excavator, for example. So it allows us to redefine in a creative way. Yeah, I would expect less work and more opportunity for us to consider what we want to do. People I know who've retired, I don't know any one of them who's complaining. They're absolutely delighted with their ability to live the life they want.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, as you say, the net wealth of human society has increased radically, but there remains a section at the bottom of society whose wealth hasn't really increased at all. It's arguably, possibly even decreased. So I mean, I was talking to Scott Santons about this, and the analogy he used, I thought quite interesting, was that there's a kind of thin sliver of people right at the bottom of human society who actually would be better off in a hunter-gatherer society. People who are homeless. And obviously, I used to live in London until quite recently. There clearly are lots of people that fall into that category. It's not an insignificant number. I mean, is this part of the argument for you, that it kind of closing up the gap, that somehow the rest of our politics and economic system has allowed these people to fall through the gap?
Yes, it is. So by definition, UBI i.e. the U meaning universal, unconditional, means that it is all embracing. So definitionally, it offers inclusion to people who currently find themselves excluded. And as far as equality is concerned, it's arithmetically true that if you pay everybody the same amount, even from their current income levels, you will eventually even up. Now, I mean, you won't even up very quickly, given the current levels of inequality, and other measures for equalizing incomes would be needed. But nevertheless, yes, it's all inclusive. And again, this comes back to some kind of philosophy of the human being, that people are born with a certain birthright, and they're born with a birthright to breathe fresh air, to enjoy the sunshine and the rain and all the rest of it. And why should only some of humanity have a birthright which includes an income, and other people not have a birthright which includes an income or any wealth? So the argument made that everybody has a right to a share in the inherited infrastructure that we have, a share in the inherited technology that we have. We're all born into that, and therefore we all have the right to access its benefits to some extent. So, you know, the extent to which life is providential, and I don't use that theologically, but nevertheless, that life is provided for us when we're born, and the extent to which our effort and labor creates an output that we then enjoy and consume, both exist. And many current systems only want to reward people according to the work they do. It's back to the work-centric view of humanity, rather than provide for them according to an element which is providential.
You have thoughts for persuading people more on the right of the political spectrum? Obviously, this being an interview for a Conservative paper, I can kind of see why left-wingers would clearly like UBI. It's clearly compatible with socialism, even if it isn't inherently socialism. But are there still obstacles to getting more right-wing people interested in it, or free market it is?
Well, for a start, not all the left support UBI. So one of the main objecting groups has been the trade unions, because they see that UBI would, they feel that UBI would reduce their responsibility for wage and employment. So their role is all to do with work and wage. And they're not happy to recognize that work and wage are inevitably reducing in their impact in society, or as their reliability for the source of income. So the left's not universally attracted to basic income. And other people on the left, including the famous modern money theory school, they're much more in favor of a job guarantee than they are in favor of UBI. And strangely enough, one of their main proponents, Randall Wray, I've been in correspondence with him, and he dismisses UBI as being a right-wing plot to avoid social benefits and so on. So, you know, across the left-right spectrum, there are very different views on UBI, job guarantee, and so on and so forth. But when you come to, I'm not sure I can deal with the kind of right-wing question so much, but your other question about free market, there are quite a lot of free market entrepreneurs, particularly those in Silicon Valley and so on, who recognize that, you know, the vast amount of automation in their case, you know, you can reach the world with a tiny group of people in San Francisco someplace. So the huge automation in the FANG companies, you know, the Netflix, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix and Google and so on, that huge productivity has caused their leaders to realize that somehow or other, in very high productivity industries in free markets, still we've got to get income to the consumers. And so people like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, he gave his address at Harvard University when he got an honorary degree, I think, but his address was about basic income. So people are beginning to realize in free market enterprises that basic income is a structural necessity in the economic system. As for right wing, I mean, if you're talking about people more in favor of free markets rather than extreme right wing nationalism or something or other, then people in favor of free markets, as I am myself, I think the attempt to run markets or industries through governments is a notable failure. So regulated free markets are generally the way the world has gone. in those environments, yeah, I mean, the argument for a basic income, because even at a pragmatic level, these firms want customers who've got money to spend.
Very interesting. But as you said, some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, have come out in favour of UBI in some form. Do you feel our politics is kind of lagging behind our economics almost in that sense, or our business leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I think politics gets hung up, doesn't it, on various pegs that in the UK it's been hung up on Brexit for a very long time, and therefore the ability to introduce any other subject has been minimal. And in the USA, the Trump period has predominated almost in terms of a personality rather than an issue. So the politics of conviction, where people are attuned to certain subjects, has rather got lost. And I think the political system is constantly conscious of its need to appeal to the voting population in appealing ways. And this is all a question of the zeitgeist, what particular ideas happen to catch on and prove hugely popular. I mean, so currently you've seen climate change very rightly achieve that sort of level of awareness in the population, and therefore political parties, as you say, are often following the game. They're following the game because they want to reflect what has become widespread in the population's awareness. So they've done that on climate change, and I welcome that. Obviously most of us do. But on basic income, we've struggled more with it, but we've been going for a very long time, and we intend to keep going. And there is a rising wave of saying this idea is not so ridiculous as it was made out to be. And there are sound, logical analytics which say that it is not only nice, but it is becoming essential in the economic system. And of course, the COVID pandemic, awful as that has been, and awful as it still is, has bounced us into a new economic paradigm. We're in a paradigm where the government is currently paying 3 million people on furlough, £24,000 a year, with a programme which costs 72 billion. That is a sort of variant of basic income brought about by necessity in a crisis. And the same thing with funding of it, because for the funding of it, whilst the government initially sold bonds to pay for the 400 billion programme, those bonds have now been bought up by the Bank of England. So we now have the Bank of England uniquely owning 875 billion pounds worth of government debt. And since the Bank of England is owned by the government, its only shareholder is the Treasury, the government actually only owes itself that money. It's a zero-sum game. So we are in a position where we see very substantial levels of UBI being paid out. I agree, it's not actually it's not universal, but it is certainly, it's not unconditional either. But nevertheless, it is replacing wage. We've got a significant payment being made, which is replacing wage. And it's being funded, I would claim, by debt-free sovereign money. Because money issued by the Bank of England to buy government shares, what is that if it's not A, debt-free, because the government's only paying itself interest, and B, actually not debt at all?
So obviously in America, to deal with coronavirus, they've been using stimulus payments, which are a slightly different route to what we've gone down, where every citizen is given a certain amount of money. I know there have been huge arguments about how much that money should be. I mean, is that more the sort of thing you had in mind as being the route into UBI?
The American Treasury has paid, I don't know what the second tranche is, but the first tranche was $1,200 checks to every American citizen. And yeah, it has been followed by a subsequent one. And I think a friend of mine was showing me his checks on Zoom the other day, that they amount to $4,000. So yes, like the UK furlough scheme, the American scheme, which I see what you mean, they're sort of stimulant to the economy, they're economic stimulus, yes. I thought you meant to the person. So they're definitely of a similar nature. They are universal in that case. Whilst the UK furlough scheme has not been universal, the USA check scheme, as far as I'm aware, has been universal, has been unconditional. And yes, I mean, it shows us a clear pathway to a universal basic income. So the mechanisms are being developed. Clearly you need people's bank accounts if you're going to be able to make them a regular monthly payment, and that data would need to be gathered, certainly in the UK. But the COVID pandemic has demonstrated the feasibility both of basic income and of debt-free sovereign money. And I think it offers us an opportunity to think more deeply and say, wow, this looks like it's feasible because we're actually doing it. And if that's feasible, that has huge implications. I mean, I'm currently preparing a paper, which I'll send you a copy of the draft afterwards, as to what the implications of this are for the bond market, for example. The bond market turns out to be completely unnecessary if the government can issue debt-free sovereign money. It doesn't need to issue money by issuing bonds. So you get rid of then a significant financialization of the economy. You get rid of the debt servicing cost, which is currently 39 billion a year, and increases by 25 billion a year for every 1% increase in the interest rate. You definancialize the economy. And there are huge benefits to this new paradigm. New paradigms come about with great difficulty. I mean, both Keynes said, and I think Max Planck said that scientific theory only changes when a generation of scientists dies out. That's a sort of rather pessimistic joke, but there was some reality behind what he was saying, because as Thomas Kuhn said, the dominant paradigm stays dominant for quite a long time until it then flips, and you say, what these guys were saying for a very long time and arguing for, actually the paradigm suddenly changes. And I think we are close to a tipping point on basic income and on debt-free sovereign money. At least that's my argument. And in the various places I presented it, whether in universities, and I've presented it at the economics departments in universities, both in the UK and in continental Europe, or presented it in various seminar discussions, no one so far has blown a logical hole in it.
The level of political interest is increasing quite rapidly. So, for example, in the UK, obviously the Liberal Democrats now support it. The Green Party supports it. Labour has been sort of flirting with it. What was their 2019 manifesto? They said they do trials or something like that. So it feels like momentum is definitely gaining. And obviously in America, with Andrew Yang, has made it almost a sort of a household name. So, I mean, if you carry on that momentum for much longer, you kind of will be into tipping point territory.
Yeah, I think that's the case. So as you say, Lib Dems voted it as party policy. It's been on the Green policy agenda for some significant time. Labour is constantly unsure in the UK because of the trade union factor that we discussed earlier. And it got buried rather in the 2019 manifesto. It's relegated to clause 55 or something or other. So because that manifesto preferred to emphasize universal basic services. So the UBS argument won the day for the Labour manifesto over the UBI argument. But Andrew Yang, and as I understand, he's currently planning to stand as mayor of New York. And I mean, if that campaign is successful, he's very definitely committed to a UBI. His thinking is pretty similar to mine, that it has a technological root. And if he can persuade the Biden administration that it's viable, which it is, we could see a huge move forward in the near future.
Yeah. But obviously various trials have been taking place across the world. So I think probably perhaps the most prominent will be one in Finland. I mean, have you been kind of seeing the sort of results you'd expect from those trial programs?
Well, the trials are useful, of course, because they generate widespread awareness of the idea. But in my view, they have fairly limited learning emerges from them. And this is whether you run them as they have been run in India and in Namibia, in Finland, and so on. The idea that if people have guaranteed income, which they never had before, that their well-being increases, I think that's pretty predictable. So in the case of the Finland experiment, where a limited number of people who were unemployed, so it's not universal, it's not unconditional, had their unemployment pay replaced by basic income, the only difference in which was that they were told it was guaranteed, but the trial only ran for 2 years. So how could they regard that as guaranteed? I'm afraid I think that the pilots have certain flaws to them in what they can claim to prove, but they do raise interest and awareness in basic income. What I want to see is a macroeconomic pilot, because in my view, the claims of UBI are only demonstrable at the national macroeconomic level. That's why I think the furlough scheme, although it's also not UBI, funded by debt-free sovereign money, brings us closer than a national pilot in Finland or a pilot in Scotland or Sheffield or whatever else it may be. So whilst, I mean, I have many colleagues with whom I'm very well connected who are sponsoring those ideas, and I do welcome the awareness they're creating, I don't think they're going to prove anything that we don't already know. In Finland, for example, the employment result, the effect on the labour market was pretty marginal. They didn't find people were either withdrawing from the labour market or more engaging in the labour market. It's a pretty neutral answer, but they did report that people's well-being was enhanced. Well, I fully expect that to be the case, and I don't think it could be anything other than enhanced. I can't see any a priori argument why the guarantee of income would not enhance your well-being. So, to me, it's almost a no-brainer and a no pilot needed question. And I'm worried that the pilots can detract interest, from the ultimate macroeconomic implementation, because they all take 2 or 3 years and we're then further down the line. I want to leap forward radically now.
One thing I thought in my head. So we've been rediscussing Western democracy and the state of how UBI could be introduced to Western democracy like the United States, United Kingdom. But what do you think the chances are for a more authoritarian country like China? Obviously, I know it's far poorer per capita. But are the same conversations happening in places like China, do you think? And are the arguments very similar?
Well, I'm not involved so far in the argument in China. I'm quite well involved in the argument in Japan, where there's a very strong basic income movement. I actually think that the Chinese model of understanding the economy is much less financially driven than the Western paradigm. So in the Western paradigm, we think we can only afford things if we've got money in the treasury. And I think the Chinese understand that the economics is built upon real factors. If you've got a real resource, if you've got labor available, if you've got technology available, then you can do things. And the money is simply a serving mechanism to that. It's the oil which oils the machine to make it happen. It's not the machine itself. Whereas in Western thinking, we sort of worship money somehow. We think it has a controlling influence. So I think the Chinese thinking, although I could be corrected on this because I'm by no means an expert on it, my observation is they see that the real investment, the real production comes first, and that generates the value in the currency. Whereas in the West, we think the value is inherent in the currency, and that determines whether we can build a bridge or not. And the Chinese think if you've got the steel and you've got the concrete, you've got the labor and the machines, then you can build the bridge, which is true. So they see, I think, money as being a derivative of the real economy, whereas we seem to think that money is the controller of the real economy. We've got the cart before the horse. If you look in some lower income economies, I currently have a colleague working in Syria, and she is Syrian, and she has a specialty in the concept of UBI in post-conflict societies. And we are looking there at what the income flow is in this currently devastated economy where many of the supply chains have been broken, how people are getting their fundamental food, for example, and how that income flow is funded, and whether basic income could better fund that income flow and be fed into the local economy to regrow that local economy. And at the moment, the flows seem to be by the Syrian government making large borrowings from both Iran and Russia. So the question at the macroeconomic level then is, that they need to get into that debt. It's a similar question, but the debt is from a different source. Could they do without those Russian and Iranian loans and simply issue their own Syrian pound for people to go and buy commodities that they're, of course, very limited at the moment, that are available? So the argument for UBI has to be tailored into each specific situation. You know, you have to know what the current structure of income flows is to the consumer, and you have to know and how they're changing, and you have to know what the current structure of government funding and its sources to say what's the right evolutionary step towards a basic income that's funded by debt-free sovereign money. But so it can be UK, it can be US, it can be China, it can be Syria. The arguments are pretty universal.
One final question. Well, it's really two questions with interlinked questions. What do you think are the main practical obstacles to seeing UBI introduced in a Western country like Britain? And the second part being, if someone's watching this and wants UBI, what's the most helpful thing they can do to campaign for it?
Well, the obstacles.
Your book, of course.
Yeah, the obstacles are fixed thinking. You know, we all grab the ideologies that we're used to because we feel secure in them. So the main obstacle is the general resistance to thinking more widely. There are some of the other obstacles we mentioned, like trade union opposition and so on. And those of us who are advocates for UBI seek to engage with the TUC quite regularly. And, you know, we're kindly met with, but haven't yet achieved the persuasion that we would want to. So I think the main obstacle, whether this includes in press comment, you see, by leading journalists, the main obstacle is they don't want to be the first to stick their head above the parapet. Because, you know, there's a communal consciousness that we all feel embedded in, and we all feel the need to be identified with, and not to stick our head up first and then be made to look silly if we're proved wrong. So, I mean, I think the common consciousness, the dominant paradigm, it's a kind of ideological, conceptual, intellectual thing, is the main thing that holds us back. Because practically, as I've said in the pandemic, when shove came to push, we needed to do it, and we have done it, and it works. In terms of advocacy, then there are quite a lot of good advocacy groups around. So UBI Labs, if you Google them, they come out of Sheffield, but they have a network of over 30 labs around the UK and several overseas as well that are campaigning for UBI with their local mayor in certain large cities, with their local councils, and with various other opinion formers. So that's one place to, I think you can get usefully involved.
Yes, it's been a real pleasure, and thank you very much for your time.